Middle-earth holds more than mountains and rivers. It carries the echoes of forgotten ages. I am your keeper of ancient knowledge, sharing the deeper lore that illuminates even the darkest mysteries. Welcome to the Untold Stories.
The secret reason why Legolas never speaks about his mother in 3,000 Years, a tale of the elder days. Section 1. Shadowed Beginnings. In the deep places of the world, where starlight first touched the leaves of Arda, there are griefs that echo still through the halls of the Eldar. Some sorrows are spoken of in song, woven into the great tales that pass from age to age, like streams flowing ever seaward. Others lie buried beneath the weight of years, too terrible for verse, too sacred for common telling. In the Woodland Realm of the Elven King, where the great boughs of oak and beech form cathedral arches beneath an ever-changing sky, there dwells a silence deeper than the quiet of winter woods. It is a silence that has followed Prince Legolas Thranduilion for 3,000 years of the world's turning, clinging to him like morning mist that will not burn away beneath even the brightest sun. The court of King Thranduil knows well this shadow that rests upon his son. They see it in the way Legolas's eyes grow distant when the harpers sing of mothers blessing their children, or when the ancient tales speak of the love between husband and wife. They mark how his step falters, though none save those with the keenest sight might notice, when he passes the chambers that have stood empty since before the Third Age began. Most telling of all, they witness the pain that crosses the king's own fair face, a pain swift as summer lightning, but deep as the roots of mountains, whenever any dare speak the name that has become forbidden in those halls. Tauriel. Once that name rang like silver bells through the corridors of the Elven King's realm. Once it was spoken with reverence and love, for she who bore it was fairer than the evening star and more beloved than the first song of spring. But now it exists only in whispers among the eldest of the Galadrim, and even then only when they think themselves unheard. For with that name comes a tale of such anguish that even the wise fear to remember it fully. The leaves of Mirkwood, for so men call that realm now, though the elves name it Erin Lasgarlan when they speak of days yet to come, rustle with more than wind when autumn comes. In their sibilant voices, those who know how to listen can hear the echoes of an ancient grief, a loss so profound that it stained the very wood and made it dark. The spiders that now creep in the southern reaches are but the least of the shadows that came from that sorrow. For when the light of the Eldar is diminished by great tragedy, all the lands they love grow dimmer with their pain. Yet in those same leaves, for those with hearts to understand, there beats also a love that death itself could not conquer. It speaks not in words, but in the way the trees lean toward the palace of the Elven King, as if yearning for one who will never again walk beneath their boughs. It whispers in the songs that the nightingales sing when Legolas passes. Melodies they learned, from a voice now stilled forever. Most clearly of all, it echoes in the eyes of the prince himself. Eyes that hold the blue of summer skies, but carry within them the depth of winter nights, when stars shine brightest, because all else has grown dark. 3 millennia have passed since that name was last spoken aloud in the halls of Thranduil's realm. 3,000 years of silence, of careful words unsaid, of memories locked away like treasures too precious and too painful to behold. And still, the hurt remains fresh as a new-made wound. For such is the nature of the firstborn, that their griefs do not fade with years, but rather deepen, like wine growing stronger in the darkness of deep cellars. But now, as shadows lengthen once more across Middle-earth, and ancient evils stir in forgotten places, the time of silence may at last be ending. For in the darkness that gathers, old wounds must sometimes be reopened, that greater healing might come. And perhaps, though none dare yet hope it, the truth so long buried may finally know the light of stars again. Section 2. A whisper in the trees. The first stirring came not with thunder or earthquake, but with the silence of leaves that should have sung. In the deepest groves of Mirkwood, where even the boldest of the Woodland Guard feared to venture after nightfall, the ancient oak stood motionless as carved stone. No wind moved their branches, yet the elves who dwelt near felt a trembling in their very souls, as if the earth itself held its breath in anticipation of some dread awakening. It was Galion, keeper of the king's cellars, and among the eldest of those who served in the palace, who first brought word of the strangeness to his lord. The winekeeper's face bore the pallor of one who has looked upon shadows better left unseen, and his hands trembled as he poured the starlight-colored vintage that had become Thranduil's sole comfort in the long years of mourning. "My lord," Galion spoke, his voice scarce above a whisper, "the trees speak of her again." The goblet in the Elven King's hand grew still, though he did not set it down. For long moments the only sound in the great hall was the distant murmur of fountains, singing their eternal songs of water over stone. When at last Thranduil spoke, his words fell like leaves in autumn, beautiful, but touched with the certainty of ending. "Impossible," he said, though even as the word left his lips, he knew it for a lie. "She has gone beyond the circles of the world. The trees know this. I have made certain they know this." But Galion, who had served 3 kings of the Wood Elves and had learned to read the signs that others missed, shook his greyed head slowly. "My lord, forgive me. But they remember more than we would have them remember. In the grove where she used to walk, where the starflowers bloomed brightest in all the wood, they are blooming again. Not with the pale light of memory, but with the full radiance of presence." The goblet fell from Thranduil's hand, shattering upon the floor in a music of crystal that seemed to echo the breaking of hearts. The wine spread like blood across the white stone, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, the king's face showed not the stern mask he had worn for 3,000 years, but the raw anguish of a soul torn asunder. "Prepare my horse," he commanded, though his voice shook like wind through winter branches. "I will see this for myself." "My lord," Galion dared to protest, "Prince Legolas rides that way even now. He has taken his bow and his white knives, speaking of spiders that trouble the southern march. But we both know that no spider has troubled that grove for 3 millennia. Thranduil finished, his eyes growing distant as starlight on water. "My son feels it too then, the call that should not be. The voice that we buried beneath stone and spell, and the weight of years unnumbered. Rising from his throne like a tree unfolding in the first light of dawn, the Elven King moved with the fluid grace that marked all his kindred. Yet there was something in his bearing now that spoke of terrible purpose. The crown upon his brow, wrought of autumn leaves and star gems, seemed to flicker with inner fire, as if responding to some ancient magic stirring in the depths of the wood. "If the dead walk again in Mirkwood," he said, and his voice carried the authority of one who had ruled for ages uncounted, "then the time of silence ends whether we will it or not. The web that was woven in darkness may yet be undone, but what price will the unraveling demand? In the groves where starflowers bloomed with impossible light, where the very air hummed with power that should have been forever lost, Prince Legolas walked paths he had not dared tread for 30 centuries, and with each step, the silence that had protected his heart grew thinner, like ice beneath the warmth of spring." Section 3. The Lone Rider. Across the grey miles of Middle-earth, where the roads run thin and the wild places press close against the paths of the wise, a rider moved with purpose through the gathering dusk. Not for him the bright company of the Eldar or the sturdy fellowship of dwarf lords. Gandalf the Grey rode as he always rode when the world's need was greatest, alone, with naught but his staff of power and the wisdom of ages for companions. Shadowfax bore him swiftly through the lands that lay between Edoras and the borders of the Woodland Realm, and though the great horse needed neither spur nor guidance, the wizard's weathered hands gripped the reins with more force than was his wont. For in the wind that blew from the east, Mithranda caught scents that troubled his ancient heart, the smell of flowers blooming out of season, and beneath it, something else. Something that spoke of magic working where magic should long have slept. He had felt it first in Rivendell, while consulting the ancient lore in Elrond's libraries. A tremor in the music of the spheres, a discordant note in the great song that shapes all things. Master Elrond had felt it too, for the Lord of Imladris had grown suddenly still while reading from the Red Book, his eyes lifting to gaze eastward with an expression of such profound unease that even Gandalf, who had known him since the elder days, felt a chill touch his heart. "Something stirs in the wood of the Elven King," Elrond had said, and his voice carried the weight of prophecy. A grief that was laid to rest awakes again, and with it, possibilities that we had deemed forever closed. Now, as Shadowfax's hooves drummed their urgent rhythm upon the earth, Gandalf found his thoughts turning not to the darkness that he had long expected to rise in the east, but to older sorrows and deeper mysteries. For in all his wanderings through the circles of the world, few tales had moved him as greatly as the story of Tauriel of the Woodland Realm. She who had loved unwisely, but too well, and whose fate had been sealed by choices that seemed right in the making, but bitter in the consequence. The wizard's grey eyes, sharp as winter stars, scanned the horizon where the first lights of the Elven King's halls gleamed like jewels scattered on dark velvet. Somewhere in those halls, he knew, Prince Legolas would be preparing for some deed that would echo through the ages, though whether for good or ill remained to be seen. And somewhere too, King Thranduil would be wrestling with memories that even the long years of the Eldar could not dim. But what of her? Gandalf murmured to the wind, and Shadowfax's ears flickered back at the sound of his voice. What of she who sleeps where starlight touches silver stone? Can even death be undone when love runs deeper than the roots of mountains? A star fell from the sky as he spoke, streaking across the darkness like a tear of light, and the wizard took it for an omen, though whether good or ill he could not say. In the lore of the Vala, the falling of stars marked great turnings in the fate of Arda, moments when the music of creation itself bent toward new harmonies. Yet stars had fallen too on the night when Tauriel rode from the halls of her king for the last time, never to return. The road wound onward through the night, and Gandalf followed it with the patience of one who had walked the ways of the world since its youth. Behind him lay the kingdoms of men, with their brief burning glories and their courage that blazed bright as summer lightning. Ahead lay the realm of the Elves, where time moved differently, and wounds healed slowly, or not at all. By dawn he would reach the borders of Mirkwood, and then perhaps he would learn what power stirred in the heart of the forest, what ancient spell worked its will in defiance of death itself. But for now, there was only the road, the star-strewn sky, and the sound of hoofbeats carrying him toward whatever revelation awaited in the halls of the Elven King. In the saddlebags behind him lay books and scrolls gathered from the libraries of the wise, texts that spoke of love and loss, of choices made in darkness, and their consequences in the light. For Gandalf suspected that before this tale reached its ending, he would need all the wisdom of ages past to guide the living through the maze of grief that awaited them. Section 4. Dol Guldur in the distance. To the south of the Woodland Realm, where the river Anduin curves like a silver serpent through the darkened lands, there rises a hill that was not made by the hands of the One. Upon that hill stands a fortress of black stone, its towers reaching toward the sky like the grasping fingers of the dead. Men call it Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery, and even the bravest among them will not look long upon its battlements, for there is a malice in those stones that pierces the heart like winter wind. Yet from the high terraces of the Elven King's palace, where the moonlight falls silver upon carved pillars, one can see the dark tower if one knows where to look and has the heart to bear its sight. On this night, as the starflowers bloomed with unnatural radiance in the deep groves, two figures stood upon the highest balcony and gazed southward into the darkness that had become their enemy. King Thranduil stood motionless as a statue wrought from pale marble, his hands resting upon the stone rail with such force that the ancient masonry cracked beneath his grip. Beside him, returned from his journey to the haunted grove, Prince Legolas maintained the disciplined silence of a warrior reporting to his lord, though in his blue eyes burned questions that had no easy answers. "She was there," Legolas said at last, and his voice held the controlled tremor of one who speaks of marvels too great for simple words. "Not in flesh. I know well the difference between the living and the dead, but her presence filled that place like summer sunlight, and the flowers." He paused, struggling to find language for what he had witnessed. "They bloomed as they did when I was but an elfling, when she would take me to that grove and teach me the names of all growing things." Thranduil's jaw tightened, but he did not turn from his contemplation of the distant tower. "What else?" he asked, though it seemed the words cost him greatly to speak. "The trees remember her voice," Legolas continued, his tone growing stronger as the warrior in him took hold. "They sing her songs when the wind moves through their branches, songs she made for me when nightmares troubled my sleep, and in the air itself." He hesitated, then pressed on with the honesty that had always marked him. "In the air itself I felt a call. Not to her, for she is beyond all calling, but to action, to some deed that would honor what she was, what she gave, what was lost when she chose love over wisdom." Thranduil finished, and now he did turn, his ancient eyes meeting those of his son. "When she chose the heart over the head, and in so choosing, doomed herself to fade from the circles of the world." Father and son stood in silence for a moment, the weight of shared grief hanging between them like a curtain of shadow. Then Legolas spoke again, his voice soft but determined. "The call leads southward, my lord, toward the darkness that has taken root in Dol Guldur. I think her presence stirs now because some great evil wakes in that place, some threat that requires her spirit to warn us." Thranduil's laugh was bitter as winter wine. "Or perhaps," he said, "the evil that dwells there feeds upon old griefs, drawing power from sorrows that should have been allowed to rest. Perhaps we are being drawn into a trap that was 3,000 years in the making." Yet even as he spoke the words, the Elven King knew them for the voice of fear rather than wisdom. For in his own heart, he felt what his son felt, the pull of something greater than vengeance, deeper than mere strategy. It was the call of love that transcends death, of bonds that not even the void can sever. In the distance, the towers of Dol Guldur seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and from their highest battlements came a sound like laughter, cold and cruel and patient as the turning of the years. Whatever power had awakened in the Hill of Sorcery, it knew that its enemies approached. It knew, and it was ready. But in the groves where starflowers bloomed, where the spirit of Tauriel lingered like morning mist touched by golden light, there was another power stirring. It spoke not of conquest, but of sacrifice, not of dominion, but of love that endures all darkness. And perhaps, though neither king nor prince dared yet to hope, it was strong enough to stand against whatever evil waited in the black fortress to the south. Section 5. Into the black dawn came grey and cheerless over the borders of Mirkwood, and with it came the wizard Gandalf, his weathered face grim beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Shadowfax bore him through the outer gates of the Woodland Realm with the tireless grace of the Mearas, but even that great horse seemed to feel the weight of the darkness that pressed upon the forest from the south. King Thranduil received the Grey Pilgrim in the Hall of Fire, where flames of silver and gold danced in braziers carved from living wood. Yet, for all the beauty of that place, there was a tension in the air that spoke of councils held in shadow and decisions that might echo through all the ages yet to come. Mithrandir, the Elven King said, inclining his golden head in greeting. You come at an hour when the very stones of my realm cry out with voices from the past. I trust this is no mere chance that brings you to my doors. Gandalf leaned heavily upon his staff, his grey eyes sharp as they took in the bearing of both king and prince. Nothing in these days comes by chance alone. Thranduil Oroferion. I felt the stirring from far Rivendell, and Elrond himself bade me ride with all speed to learn what power wakes in the heart of your wood. But I confess, I did not expect to find the very air singing with echoes of the Valar's music. At these words, Legolas stepped forward, his fair face troubled but resolute. If you speak of my mother's presence, he said, then yes, she walks again in the grove where her starflowers bloom, not in body, for that lies at peace beneath the malon trees of Lothlorien, but in spirit, and that spirit calls us southward, toward Dol Guldur. The wizard's thick brows drew together in thought. The hill of sorcery has long been a festering wound upon the body of Middle-earth, he said slowly. 9 years ago, the White Council drove the necromancer from his stronghold there. Yet we knew even then that evil would return to that place. It draws darkness as a lodestone draws iron. He paused, studying the faces before him. But what does the spirit of one long dead have to do with the shadow that dwells there now? Thranduil rose from his throne like a tree stirring in the wind, his robes of deep green and brown rustling with the movement. That, old friend, is a tale that has been 3,000 years in the telling. Come, if you would understand the call that draws us toward darkness, you must know first what light was lost when that darkness first took root. Together they walked from the hall, past tapestries that showed the glory of the Woodland Realm in its youth, when the shadow of Dol Guldur was but a whisper, and the paths through Mirkwood ran clear and safe. They came at last to a chamber that few had entered since the Third Age began, a room of white stone and crystal, where moonlight fell through windows carved like leaves upon a shrine that stood empty of all save memory. Here, Thranduil said, his voice soft as the whisper of wind through silver branches. Here she would come to pray when the darkness first began to creep into our wood. Here she made her choice between the safety of our realm and the call of her heart. Here she spoke the words that doomed her to fade, and in her fading cast a shadow that has haunted us ever since. Gandalf looked upon the empty shrine, with eyes that had seen the music of creation itself, and slowly he began to understand. She bound herself to the defense of the wood, he said, and it was not a question, but a statement heavy with recognition. She poured her very essence into the earth and trees, making herself a guardian against the shadow. But such a binding, he shook his head, such a binding should have lasted until the end of all things. Unless, Legolas said quietly, the evil against which she bound herself has grown strong enough to break even such bonds. Unless the very power she used to protect us has become a weapon that our enemies can turn against us. In the silence that followed, they could hear it, the sound that had haunted the Woodland Realm for 3 millennia. It was the whisper of leaves that held no wind, the echo of a voice that sang no more, the call of love that death could not silence. And now, for the first time in all those long years, it was growing stronger. The shadows were stirring in Dol Guldur, and they knew the secret of Tauriel's sacrifice. They knew, and they meant to use it. Section 6. The Captive King. In the deepest dungeons of Dol Guldur, where neither starlight nor moonbeam had ever fallen, there lay a prisoner who had forgotten his own name. Chained with bonds forged in the fires of Mount Doom, he hung between pillars of black stone, while shadows whispered secrets that mortal minds were never meant to know. Time had no meaning in that place of eternal darkness, and he might have suffered there for decades or centuries. Even he could not say. Yet on this night, as the spirit of Tauriel stirred in the distant groves of Mirkwood, something changed in the prisoner's torment. The shadows that had been his only companions for so long began to speak not in the harsh tongue of Mordor, but in the fair speech of the Eldar. And in that speech, they told tales that pierced his heart like silver arrows. "Do you know her name?" the darkness whispered, and the voice was neither male nor female, but something altogether more terrible. She who binds the wood with threads of starlight, she who made herself a bridge between the world of the living and the halls of the dead. Her love protects those trees, and her sacrifice guards the paths where her people walk. But love can be turned to other purposes. Little king, love can be made to serve the darkness. The prisoner raised his head with effort that cost him greatly, for the chains were wrought with more than mortal metal, through matted hair that had once shone golden as summer wheat. Eyes blue as winter sky looked up into the void that surrounded him. "Thrain," he whispered, the name coming back to him like an echo from another life. "Thrain, son of Thror, king of Durin's folk." Memory flooded back. The quest for the lonely mountain, the dragonfire that had driven his people into exile, the madness that had seized him when his ring was taken. "And you are the voice that speaks from shadow, the necromancer of this accursed place." Laughter filled the darkness, cold and cruel as the sound of breaking ice. "I am many things, little king. I am the shadow that falls across the sun, the voice that speaks in the silence between heartbeats. But you may call me Sauron, for that is the name by which the wise know me. And you, Thrain king in exile, you shall be my messenger." "I will carry no message for you," Thrain replied, though his voice shook with the effort of defiance. "I am a king of the dwarves, and we bow to no darkness." "Oh, but you will," the voice continued, and now it carried a note of terrible amusement. "For the message I would have you bear is not one of conquest or threat, but of love. Tell me, little king, what do you know of the elf queen who died for love of a dwarf?" Thrain's blood ran cold, for in the ancient lore of his people, there were few tales more bitter than that of Tauriel of the Woodland Realm, she who had loved Kili, son of Dis, in defiance of all wisdom, she who had chosen the heart over the head, and in so choosing, had doomed herself to fade from the circles of the world. "She is dead," he said, but even as he spoke the words, he felt their inadequacy. She chose to bind her spirit to the protection of Mirkwood, rather than follow her beloved beyond the circles of the world. She sleeps beneath the malin trees of Lothlorien, and her love guards the Woodland Realm. Sleeps. The laughter came again, more terrible than before. "Oh, little king, how little you understand the power of love that transcends death. She does not sleep, she watches, she waits, and when the time comes, she will rise to defend those she loved, no matter what the cost to herself or others." In the darkness, shapes began to form, not solid, but substantial enough that they cast shadows of their own. They were memories given form, scenes from the past made visible in the black air of the dungeon. Thrain saw a wood elf maiden fair as starlight, her red gold hair flowing like flame as she tended the wounds of a young dwarf warrior. He saw love kindle between them like fire catching in dry tinder, bright and fierce and doomed from the first moment it blazed. "She loved my grandson," Thrain whispered, understanding flooding through him like bitter wine. "Kili, the young fool who thought his heart stronger than the hatred between our peoples. And for that love, she sacrificed everything. Sauron's voice hissed through the shadows. Her immortality, her place among the firstborn, even her hope of peace in the halls of Mandos. She bound herself to the very stones and trees of Mirkwood, becoming a guardian against the darkness that crept from my fortress. But now, the voice paused, and in that pause was the promise of revelation terrible to hear. Now I have found the key to break her binding, to turn her very love against those she died to protect. The shapes in the darkness shifted, and now Thrain saw a different scene. A young elf prince with hair bright as sunlight, learning the arts of bow and blade from a maiden whose face was touched with sorrow. He saw the love between mother and child, the bond that not even death could fully sever. Legolas, Thrain breathed, the name escaping him like a prayer or a curse. Her son, Sauron confirmed, the living link between her spirit and the world of flesh. Through him, her power can be channeled. Through him, the very love that protects Mirkwood can be turned to its destruction. And you, little king, you will help me claim him. Never, Thrain snarled, struggling against his bonds with fury born of desperation. I may be your prisoner, but I will not be your tool. But even as he spoke the words, he felt the shadow's power pressing against his mind, seeking the cracks that long torment had opened in his will. For Sauron had not kept him alive all these years, merely for the pleasure of his suffering. He had been shaped, slowly and carefully, into a weapon that would strike at the heart of hope itself. And now, at last, the time had come to use him. Section 7. The Necromancer's Voice. In the highest tower of Dol Guldur, where the ancient stones were black with more than time's passage, the necromancer sat upon a throne carved from the heartwood of trees that had grown before the first sunrise. His form was shadow within shadow, neither fully present nor entirely absent, for he was not yet strong enough to take solid shape in Middle-earth. But his will was iron and his purpose clear as crystal poison. Before him hung a palantir, one of the seeing stones of Numenor, its surface clouded with visions that shifted like smoke in the wind. Within its depths, he watched the movements of his enemies. The wizard Gandalf riding hard toward the Woodland Realm, King Thranduil pacing like a caged wolf in his halls, and most importantly, Prince Legolas standing in the grove where starflowers bloomed with unnatural light. So, the necromancer spoke, his voice echoing through the empty halls of his fortress. The son comes to the place where his mother's spirit lingers strongest. How fitting, how useful. Around him, the shadows stirred with anticipation, for they were drawn to the malice that radiated from their master like heat from a forge. These were the spirits of the fallen, those who had chosen darkness in life and found themselves bound to the hill of sorcery in death. They hungered for the light of the living, and they would serve any purpose that might grant them a taste of what they had lost. Master, one of them whispered, its voice like the rustle of dead leaves. The binding that holds the Elf Queen's spirit is strong. For 3,000 years it has stood against our influence. How can even your power hope to break what was forged in love's sacrifice? The necromancer's laugh was cold as winter wind through empty halls. Because, my faithful servant, love is the greatest weakness of all the free peoples. They think it makes them strong, but in truth, it leaves them vulnerable in ways they can never understand. The Elf Queen bound herself to protect those she loved, but what if those very loved ones walk willingly into danger? What if her own son, the light of her heart, comes to my fortress of his own accord? In the Palantir, the vision shifted, showing now the interior of the Elven King's palace, where 3 figures stood in urgent council. Gandalf's voice drifted up from the Seeing Stone's depths, speaking words that made the necromancer smile with terrible satisfaction. The darkness in Dol Guldur feeds upon old griefs, the wizard was saying. If Tauriel's spirit stirs now, it is because some great evil there seeks to use her love against the very realm she died to protect. Then we must go to her, came Legolas's reply, clear and determined as the call of trumpets. If her spirit calls to me from that accursed place, then I must answer. I cannot let her sacrifice be turned against our people. And there, the necromancer whispered to his shadows, there is the hook baited with the most irresistible lure of all, the desire to protect what we love. The young prince will come to Dol Guldur, driven by the very nobility that makes him most vulnerable to my influence. And when he does, the shadows pressed closer, eager to hear their master's plan revealed in full. But the necromancer was savoring this moment, tasting the anticipation like wine upon his tongue. For so long he had been forced to work in secret, to hide his growing power behind masks and misdirection. But now, with the proper tool at last within his grasp, he could strike a blow that would echo through all the ages of the world. When he comes, the Dark Lord continued, I will show him visions of his mother's torment. I will let him see how her spirit writhes in bonds of my making, how her very love has become the chains that hold her. And then I will offer him a choice, surrender himself to my will, and I will grant her spirit peace. Refuse and watch as I use her essence to bring shadow upon all the lands she died to protect. But Master, another shadow dared to ask, what if the wizard and the king come with him? What if they see through your deception? Let them come, the necromancer replied, his voice rich with malicious pleasure. Gandalf the Grey thinks himself wise in the ways of the spirit realm, but he has never loved as the elves love. He has never felt the bonds that tie immortal hearts across the gulfs of death. And King Thranduil, that one will be the most useful of all, for he still blames himself for his beloved's fate, still carries the guilt of choices made in darkness. When he sees his son threatened, when he must choose between his crown and his heart, he will break like glass before fire. The Palantir showed new visions now, scenes from the past when Tauriel had walked in the halls of the Woodland Realm, her laughter bright as silver bells, her love a warmth that drove back the creeping shadows. But these images were twisted, corrupted by the necromancer's will, until they showed not joy, but sorrow, not love, but loss. I will use their own memories against them, Sauron said, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to fill all the dark corners of his tower. I will show them what was, and what might have been, and what will be if they defy me. And in the end, they will choose as all the free peoples choose when pressed to their limits. They will choose love over wisdom, heart over head. And in that choice, they will hand me the victory I have sought for 3,000 years. Outside the tower, storm clouds gathered in the southern sky, and lightning flickered between their depths like the eyes of sleeping dragons. The time of waiting was almost over. Soon, very soon, the final act of this long-planned drama would begin. Section 8. Fire in the Darkness. The company that rode from the gates of the Woodland Realm in the grey hour before dawn was small but grim with purpose. King Thranduil led them, clad in mail that shimmered like starlight, and bearing the sword, Orcris, that had been returned to him by the wizard. Beside him rode Prince Legolas, his bow of mallen wood strung and ready, his white knives gleaming at his side, and with them came Gandalf the Grey, his staff crowned with light that no shadow could fully quench. Behind them, at a distance that spoke of reluctance rather than courage, came the dwarf King Thrain, son of Thor. The wizard had freed him from his chains in the dungeons of Dol Guldur, through arts that required payment in blood and starlight. But the long years of torment had left their mark upon him. His beard was white as winter snow, his eyes haunted by visions that mortal minds were never meant to see. Yet he rode with them, for in his heart burned a fire that not even the necromancer's malice could fully extinguish. The desire to atone for the part he had played in the tragedy that was about to unfold. They took the secret paths that few knew, roads that wound through the deepest heart of Mirkwood, where the trees grew close and the air hung thick with ancient magic. These were the ways that Thranduil had walked in the last days of her life, when the darkness first began to seep into the wood and she sought the power to hold it back. Now they glowed with faint silver light, as if her spirit lit their passage like candles in a darkened hall. "She knows we come," Legolas said softly, his keen eyes reading the signs that others missed. "The very stones sing of her presence, and the trees lean in to listen as we pass. But there is something else." He paused, his fair face troubled by what he sensed but could not name. "There is a wrongness in the music, a discord that grows stronger as we approach the Hill of Sorcery." Gandalf nodded grimly, his grey eyes fixed upon the dark tower that loomed ever larger ahead of them. "The enemy has had 3,000 years to study the bonds that hold her spirit," he said. 3,000 years to find the weakness in even love's greatest strength. We must be prepared for treachery beyond anything we have yet imagined. What treachery could be greater than using a mother's love against her own son? Thranduil asked, his voice bitter as winter wine. But even as he spoke the words, he felt the truth of them like a blade to the heart. For was that not exactly what he was doing? Allowing his son to walk into mortal danger because neither of them could bear to let Thranduil's spirit suffer alone. The road began to climb now, winding up the slopes of the hill where Dol Guldur stood like a black fist raised against the sky. With each step their horses took, the air grew heavier, charged with malice that made their very souls recoil. This was a place where darkness had put down roots so deep that even the earth itself had been corrupted, where the stones remembered only pain and the very grass grew black beneath their feet. As they approached the outer gates of the fortress, those gates swung open of their own accord, revealing a courtyard where no living thing grew and shadows moved without any source to cast them. In the center of that desolate space stood a figure that might once have been a man, though darkness had so changed him that little of his original form remained. "Welcome, King of the Wood Elves," the figure spoke, and its voice was the sound of bones grinding beneath millstones. "Welcome, Prince of Starlight and Sorrow, and welcome most especially to you, Gandalf Stormcrow, who think yourself wise in the ways of power. I am the Lieutenant of Barad-dûr, and my master has been expecting you." Thranduil's sword rang as it left its sheath, the blade's light driving back the shadows that pressed close around them. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice carrying all the authority of one who had ruled in Middle-earth since the elder days. "Where is the spirit you have dared to bind?" The lieutenant laughed, a sound like the breaking of glass in a frozen hall. "She is here," he said, gesturing toward the highest tower of the fortress. "She has been here for longer than you know, singing lamentations that would break your heart to hear. But if you would free her—" The creature's smile was terrible to behold. "If you would free her, you must first face the truth of what her love has cost." With words of power that shook the very foundations of the hill, Gandalf struck at the lieutenant with staff and spell, driving him back into the shadows from whence he came. But even as the creature fled, its laughter echoed from the stones, promising revelations that would turn hope to despair and love to bitter ash. "Come then," the wizard said, his voice grim with foreboding. "Let us climb to the tower and face whatever evil awaits us there. But remember this, in darkness, the greatest weapon is truth twisted until it serves the shadow's purpose. Whatever we see, whatever we hear, we must hold fast to what we know of love's true nature." Together, they entered the black halls of Dol Guldur, their footsteps echoing like the beat of distant drums as they climbed toward the revelation that would either save Tauriel's spirit or damn them all to the very darkness they sought to defeat. Section 9. Return to the Wise. The White Council convened in the hidden valley of Rivendell as autumn's first chill touched the air, and the faces gathered around Elrond's table bore the weight of tidings that none had wished to hear. Gandalf had returned from Dol Guldur with knowledge dearly bought and scars that would not heal, while beside him sat figures whose very presence spoke of how desperate the hour had become. King Thranduil occupied a chair of carved wood, his golden hair dim with dust from dark places, and his eyes holding shadows that had not been there when last the wise convened. Prince Legolas stood behind his father's chair, his young face marked by visions that had aged him beyond his years. And at the table's foot sat Thrain, son of Thror, freed from his torment, but bearing still the weight of secrets that the enemy had forced him to learn. "Tell us," said Elrond, his ageless face grave with concern, "what power stirs in the hill of sorcery, and how it touches upon the fate of one we had thought at peace." Gandalf leaned heavily upon his staff, and those who knew him well could see how the ordeal had cost him. "The necromancer has found the key to a lock we thought forever sealed," he said, his voice hoarse with more than weariness. "Tauriel's spirit, bound by love to the protection of Mirkwood, has become a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Through that bridge, the enemy can reach across the gulf that separates his servants from those they would corrupt. But how?" asked Saruman the White, his voice sharp with the urgency of one who sees his careful plans unraveling. "The binding was wrought in the very moment of her choosing, sealed with sacrifice, and made permanent by love itself. What power could break such bonds?" It was Thrain who answered, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge forced upon him in torment. "Not break," he said slowly, "corrupt. The necromancer showed me how love can be turned against itself, how the very desire to protect can become the means of destruction." He lifted his head, meeting the eyes of each council member in turn. "He means to use her love for her son to force her spirit into his service." Legolas stepped forward, his hand resting upon the hilt of his white knife. "Then we must cut the binding," he said, his voice clear despite the pain it carried. "If her love for me makes her vulnerable to the enemy's will, then that love must be severed. Let her spirit go free to whatever peace awaits beyond the circles of the world." "No," Thranduil said sharply, rising from his chair with sudden force. "You do not understand what you ask. The binding is not merely magical. It is woven into the very fabric of Mirkwood itself. To cut it would be to tear the heart from the wood, to leave our realm defenseless against every shadow that creeps from the south." "Then what do you counsel?" Galadriel asked, her voice soft but carrying the authority of one who had seen the music of creation itself. "For if the enemy can indeed turn Tauriel's protection into a weapon against us, then we face a threat unlike any we have encountered." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, broken only by the sound of wind in the eaves and the distant murmur of the Bruinen as it flowed past Rivendell's walls. Each member of the council turned over the problem in their minds, seeking wisdom that seemed always just beyond their grasp. Finally, it was Gandalf who spoke again, his grey eyes distant with thought. "There is perhaps one hope," he said slowly. "In the ancient law of the Valar, it is written that love freely given cannot be compelled, only twisted by fear and despair. If we could find a way to show Tauriel's spirit the truth, that her son comes to the Dark Tower, not from compulsion, but from choice, not from weakness, but from strength, then perhaps the binding could be purified rather than broken." "You speak of entering the very heart of the enemy's power," Elrond observed, of facing Sauron himself in the place where his strength is greatest. Few have attempted such a thing, and survived to tell of it. And yet, Thranduil said, his voice growing stronger as understanding dawned, if it is her love that makes her vulnerable, then perhaps it is also our love that can make her strong. Not the possessive love that seeks to hold and control, but the selfless love that is willing to let go. Legolas looked at his father with new understanding, seeing in the king's ancient eyes a decision that had been 3,000 years in the making. "You mean to free her," he said, and it was not a question but a recognition. "I mean to give her the choice she was denied before," Thranduil replied. In darkness and in haste, she bound herself to protect what she loved. But now, in full knowledge of the cost, she must be allowed to choose again, whether to maintain the binding that guards our wood, or to break it and find whatever peace awaits her in the halls beyond the world. The council fell silent again, each member contemplating the magnitude of what was being proposed. To enter Dol Guldur, to face the necromancer in his very stronghold, to offer freedom to one whose sacrifice had protected them for 3 millennia. It was a plan born of love rather than strategy, of hope rather than wisdom, and perhaps, in the end, that was exactly what was needed. Section 10. Stirring the North. In the great halls beneath the lonely mountain, where dragonfire had once burned and the king under the mountain now held court, there came in the depths of winter a visitor whose presence stirred memories both bitter and sweet. Gandalf the Grey stood before the throne of Dane Ironfoot, his weathered face grave with the weight of tidings that would reshape the fate of all the free peoples. "You speak of madness, old friend," King Dane said, his strong hands gripping the arms of his throne, carved from solid granite. "To march upon Dol Guldur is to court death for any who undertake such a quest, and to do so for the sake of an elf queen who chose her own doom." He shook his head, his braided beard swaying with the motion. "The folk of Durin have paid enough for the follies of love between elf and dwarf." But beside the king's throne stood another figure, one whose presence made Gandalf's heart lift with hope unexpected. Dain's son, young Thorin, bore his grandfather's name and much of his noble bearing, yet in his eyes burned a fire that spoke of understanding beyond his years. "Father," the young prince said, his voice carrying the weight of careful thought, "was it not love between elf and dwarf that brought about the very doom from which we now seek to protect all lands? And if that same love, freely chosen and nobly given, can now serve to heal the wound it opened, should we not at least consider the possibility?" Dain's eyes narrowed as he studied his son's face. "You speak as one who has some knowledge of this matter beyond what the wizard has told us. What have you been reading in the archives, my boy?" Thorin straightened, meeting his father's gaze with the courage that had always marked their line. "The full tale of Kili Durin's son and Tauriel of the Woodland Realm," he said simply. "It is written in the chronicles that Uncle Balin kept, though few have sought to read those pages. Their love was real, father, and her sacrifice was made not from weakness, but from the highest nobility. To dishonor it now would be to prove ourselves unworthy of the mountain kingdom that their choices helped restore to us." Gandalf watched this exchange with growing hope, for he had come to Erebor seeking not just the strength of arms that the dwarves could provide, but the deeper understanding that only those touched by the tale could offer. In the young prince's words, he heard echoes of the wisdom that had once moved hearts to great deeds. "There is more," the wizard said carefully, gauging the mood of both king and prince. "The binding that holds Tauriel's spirit is weakening, and when it breaks, as break it must, whether by the enemy's corruption or by our own actions, the protection it has provided to all the northern lands will fail. The darkness will pour out of Dol Guldur like water through a broken dam, and no realm will stand secure against its flood. King Dain rose from his throne and began to pace, his heavy boots ringing against the stone floor. "You paint a grim picture, Mithrandir. If what you say is true, then we face a choice between certain peril and possible doom." He paused, turning to face the wizard with eyes that held the weight of kingship. "What would you have of us?" "Not armies," Gandalf replied, surprising them both. "Not the war host of Erebor marching to battle against the gates of the enemy's stronghold, but rather a few, chosen for their understanding of love's true nature and the sacrifices it demands. Those who can stand witness to a choice that must be freely made, who can guard the freedom of that choosing against all who would compel it." Young Thorin stepped forward, his hand moving unconsciously to the hilt of his sword. "I will go," he said simply. "If Kili, my kinsman, loved her enough to die for her sake, then I can risk death to help her find peace." "As will I," came another voice from the shadows of the hall. Balin the White stepped into the light, his ancient face bearing the lines of one who had lived through the full span of the tragedy. "I was there when it began, when young Kili's heart first turned toward the Woodland Realm. Perhaps it is fitting that I should be there when the tale reaches its ending." Dain looked from his son to his oldest counselor, seeing in their faces a determination that no royal command could shake. "Very well," he said at last, his voice heavy with the weight of fatherly fear. "But if you go to face the darkness in its very heart, you will go with such protection as the kingdom under the mountain can provide." He turned to the guards who stood at attention beside the great doors. "Summon the weapon rights and the law masters. If we send our prince into the shadow, he will bear such arms and armor as befits his noble purpose." Through the long night that followed, the forges of Erebor rang with purposeful hammering as mastersmiths worked by firelight to craft weapons that could stand against the powers of darkness. They forged mail that would turn aside the touch of shadow, blades that would shine with their own light in the deepest darkness, and shields that bore upon them the symbols of hope and protection. But greatest of all their works was a small thing, a pendant wrought from mithril and set with a chip of the Arkenstone itself. Upon its surface were carved the words that Kili had spoken in his final moments, when he chose love over life and death over dishonor. It was a reminder of what they fought for, and of the price that true love sometimes demands. As dawn broke over the lonely mountain, painting its peaks with fire and gold, the company that would ride to Dol Guldur gathered in the great courtyard. They were few in number, but mighty in purpose, bound together by bonds stronger than steel, and carrying with them the hopes of all who loved freedom. The tale was moving toward its climax, and the choices made in the darkness ahead would echo through all the ages yet to come. Section 11. A Hobbit Remembered. In the green lands of the Shire, where the grass grows thick and the gardens bloom in careful rows, life continued its ancient rhythm undisturbed by the great doings in distant realms. The hobbits of Hobbiton went about their daily business with the contented certainty of folk who believed the world to be a safe and reasonable place, where the greatest dangers were late frosts and the occasional disagreement between neighbours over the proper height of garden hedges. Yet in Bag End, the finest hobbit hole in all the Shire, there dwelt one who knew better than most that the world beyond the Brandywine was neither safe nor reasonable. Bilbo Baggins sat in his study surrounded by the treasures he had gathered on his unexpected journey, but his gnarled fingers traced not the outline of golden cups or silver plates, but rather the pages of a book bound in red leather, the record of his adventures that he had been writing for nigh on 60 years. The knock at his green door came as the afternoon sun slanted long and golden through his windows, and when he opened it, he found not one of his hobbit neighbours, but a figure both familiar and welcome, despite the shadows that seemed to cling about his grey robes. "Gandalf," Bilbo exclaimed, his weathered face lighting with genuine pleasure. "My dear fellow, how delightful to see you again. Though I must say, you look rather more careworn than when last you darkened my doorstep. Come in, come in. I've got the kettle on, and there's seed cake fresh from the oven." The wizard entered the comfortable hobbit hole with the air of one seeking refuge from storms both physical and spiritual. As Bilbo bustled about preparing tea with the efficiency of long practice, Gandalf found his eyes drawn to the red book that lay open upon the writing desk. "Still working on your memoirs, I see," the wizard observed, his voice carrying a note of something deeper than mere curiosity. "Oh yes, indeed," Bilbo replied, setting down the tea service with careful precision. "Though I must confess, I find myself returning again and again to certain passages, certain encounters that perhaps made more impression upon me than I realized at the time." He paused, his bright eyes growing thoughtful. "That business with the Wood Elves, for instance, King Thranduil and his people. There was something there, some sorrow that ran deeper than the mere troubles of the moment." Gandalf accepted the offered cup with hands that trembled slightly, a motion that did not escape the hobbit's keen observation. "You have a perceptive heart, old friend," the wizard said slowly. "There was indeed a sorrow in those halls, one that has echoed through 3,000 years and may yet reshape the fate of all Middle-earth." "Ah," Bilbo said, settling into his favorite chair with the air of one prepared for a long tale. "I thought as much. There was a sadness in the king's eyes, and in his son's as well. Young Legolas, wasn't it? Beautiful as starlight, but carrying some burden that seemed too heavy for one so fair to bear." He leaned forward, his face alive with curiosity. "Will you tell me the truth of it, Gandalf? The real story behind the shadows in the Woodland Realm?" And so, as the afternoon faded into evening and the candles burned low in their holders, Gandalf told the tale of Tauriel and Kili, of love that transcended the ancient enmity between elf and dwarf, and of the sacrifice that had protected the northern lands for 3 millennia. He spoke of the choice that now faced them all, of the mission that would take him once more into darkness, and of the desperate hope that love freely given might yet prove stronger than the corruption of the enemy. Bilbo listened with the attention of one who had learned to hear the deeper music beneath the surface of events, asking few questions, but offering the gift of understanding that only those touched by adventure could provide. When at last the tale was done, he sat in silence for a long moment, his bright eyes fixed upon the fire that danced in his hearth. "Love," he said finally, his voice soft with wonder. "It always comes back to love in the end, doesn't it? The greatest adventures, the most perilous quests, the choices that echo through the ages, they're all born from love of one kind or another." "Indeed," Gandalf agreed, his weathered face grave in the firelight. "And that is why I have come to you, dear Bilbo, not seeking aid in the form of sword or shield, for I know that your adventuring days are behind you, but rather seeking the wisdom that comes from having loved well and chosen freely." The hobbit's eyebrows rose in surprise. "My wisdom? My dear Gandalf, I'm nothing but an old hobbit, who once had the remarkable good fortune to survive a dragon and live to tell about it. What wisdom could I possibly offer to such a grave matter? The wisdom of one who learned that the smallest act of love can change the course of history," the wizard replied. "Do you remember the moment when you chose to spare Gollum's life in the tunnels beneath the misty mountains? A moment of pity, nothing more. Yet it may prove to be the hinge upon which the fate of all Middle-earth turns." Bilbo's eyes grew distant as memory carried him back to that dark place where he had first found the ring. "I could have killed him," he murmured. "Should have, perhaps. He was a wretched thing, and dangerous. But something stayed my hand. Not fear, not weakness, but compassion, I suppose. The recognition that he was pitiable rather than merely hateful." "Exactly," Gandalf said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. "And in that moment of compassion, you chose love over vengeance, mercy over justice. It is that kind of choosing that we face now in the halls of Dol Guldur. Not the love that seeks to possess or control, but the love that is willing to let go, to grant freedom even when freedom brings pain. The hobbit nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his bright eyes. "You want me to remember that tale," he said, "to write it down as part of my book, so that others might understand what it means to choose love in the face of darkness." "More than that," Gandalf replied, "I want you to believe in it. For if an old hobbit in the Shire can hold fast to the truth that love is stronger than hate, that mercy is greater than vengeance, then perhaps there is hope yet for a queen who bound herself in love, and a prince who must choose whether to let her go." As the night deepened around Bag End, the two old friends sat together in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves of the old forest, carrying with it whispers of change and the promise of adventures yet to come. In his heart, Bilbo felt the truth of what the wizard had said, and he knew that his part in this great tale was not yet ended. For sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with sword and shield, but with pen and parchment, preserving the truth of love's victory for all who would come after. Section 12. The plan set in motion. In the depths of winter, when snow lay thick upon the paths of Middle-earth, and the world seemed wrapped in the silence of sleep, the final preparations began. From Rivendell rode forth a company, unlike any that had ever set out upon the roads of the wild. Elves and dwarves united in purpose, wizard and warriors bound by bonds stronger than ancient enmity, all driven by the desperate hope that love might yet prove stronger than the darkness that sought to corrupt it. King Thranduil led them, his golden hair bound beneath a helm of mithril and leaves, his sword Orcris singing softly in its sheath, as if eager for the battle to come. Beside him rode Prince Legolas, his bow strung and his white knives gleaming, yet in his blue eyes was not the light of war, but the deeper radiance of one who rides towards a choice that will define the very nature of his soul. Behind them came the dwarves of Erebor, young Prince Thorin bearing arms that had been blessed in the forges of his ancestors, and Balin the White, whose beard flowed like snow over mail that rang with each step of his pony. They had set aside the ancient grievances of their peoples for this quest, bound together by the understanding that some loves transcend all barriers of race and realm. Gandalf the Grey rode at the company's heart, his staff crowned with light that no shadow could fully quench, his weathered face set with the grim determination of one who has seen the music of creation itself and knows what harmonies are at stake. Upon his finger gleamed Narya, the red ring, whose fire burned with the power to kindle hope in the darkest places. And with them, walking rather than riding for his legs were too short for any horse, came an unexpected member whose presence spoke of choices made in defiance of all prudence. Thorin Oakenshield, king under the mountain, had abdicated his throne to his son for the span of this quest, declaring that some debts could only be paid by kings themselves. "You need not have come," Thranduil said as they made camp on the borders of Mirkwood, where the trees grew close and the shadows held whispers of ancient sorrow. "This is not your burden to bear, son of Thrain." "Is it not?" Thorin replied, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he stared into the flames that danced between them. "It was my nephew whose love began this tale, my blood that was spilled to seal it. If there is redemption to be found in the ending, then let it be won by one who shares the guilt of its beginning." Legolas looked up from the string of his bow, which he had been checking with the careful attention of a warrior preparing for battle. "There is no guilt in love freely given," he said quietly. "My mother chose her fate with full knowledge of its price. Your nephew chose his with the courage that marks all true hearts. In neither case was there anything but honor." "Honor," Thorin said. and his voice carried the weight of kingship and the deeper weight of remorse. Yes, there was honor in their choosing, but was there wisdom? Could they not have found another way, one that did not demand such terrible sacrifice? It was Gandalf who answered, his grey eyes distant with the memory of sorrows beyond counting. Wisdom is not the enemy of love, my dear Thorin, any more than love is the enemy of wisdom. But sometimes they pull in different directions, and in those moments we must choose which voice to follow. Your nephew and Legolas's mother chose love, and in so choosing, they wrote their names in the great tales that will outlast the turning of the world. And now, Balin added, his ancient voice steady as stone, we choose whether their tale ends in tragedy or triumph, whether the love they bore for each other becomes a weapon in the enemy's hand, or the key to a victory greater than any that could be won by sword and shield alone. As the night deepened around their fire, they spoke of the plan that had been crafted in the councils of the wise. Not a plan of war, but one of liberation, not seeking to destroy but to heal. They would enter Dol Guldur not as conquerors, but as witnesses, offering to Tauriel's bound spirit the choice that had been denied her in the moment of her original sacrifice. She must be free to choose, Thranduil said, his voice heavy with the pain of a decision 3,000 years in the making. Free to maintain the binding that protects our lands, or free to break it and find whatever peace awaits beyond the circles of the world. Only in such freedom can love retain its true nature, uncorrupted by compulsion or fear. And if she chooses to break the binding? Young Thorin asked. If she decides that 3 millennia of guardianship is enough, and seeks the rest that has so long been denied her? Then we will honor her choice, Legolas replied, though the words seemed to cost him greatly. And we will find other ways to guard against the darkness, ways that do not require the sacrifice of one we love. The fire burned low as they spoke, casting long shadows that danced like memories upon the walls of trees around them. In those shadows, it seemed to the more sensitive among them that other figures moved, the spirits of all who had loved and lost, all who had chosen the heart over the head and paid the price that such choosing demands. Tomorrow they would ride to Dol Guldur, to the final confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Tauriel's spirit, but the nature of love itself in Middle-earth. Tonight, they sat around their fire and remembered that some bonds are stronger than death, some choices echo through all the ages of the world, and some loves burn with a light that no darkness can extinguish. The tale was moving toward its climax, and the choices made in the hours ahead would reshape the very foundations of hope and despair in the hearts of all the free peoples. Section 13. The Fire Awakens. In the furnace heart of the lonely mountain, where Dragonflame had once burned with the fury of ancient greed, something stirred that had slumbered for 60 years. The death of Smaug the Mighty had not ended the magic that bound fire to gold in the deepest treasuries of Erebor. It had merely changed its nature, transforming the destructive rage of the dragon into something altogether more subtle and far more dangerous. Young Thorin felt it first as he descended into the treasure chambers to retrieve a gift for the quest ahead, a small token that had belonged to his uncle Kili in the days before love and loss had reshaped the fate of kingdoms. The gold that lay heaped in those vast halls seemed to whisper as he passed, singing songs that spoke not of greed, but of longing, not of possession, but of sacrifice. "Do you hear it?" he asked Balin, who had accompanied him into the depths with the careful tread of one who remembered the dragon's power. "The music in the metal. It's not the same song it sang when Smaug was alive." The ancient dwarf paused, his grey head tilted in concentration as he listened to harmonies that few could perceive. "Aye, lad," he said slowly. "I hear it. It sings now of love rather than hunger, of giving rather than taking. The dragon's death purified it. But something else shapes its music now, something that calls to the very quest we undertake. They found what they sought in a chamber smaller than the great treasure halls, where personal effects of the royal line were kept separate from the mountain's wealth. Kili's bow lay upon a table of carved stone, its wood still gleaming with the care he had lavished upon it in life. Beside it lay a quiver of arrows fletched with the blue-black feathers of ravens, and wrapped around both was a cloak that held still the faint scent of starflowers. "She gave this to him," Thorin whispered, his fingers tracing the fine weave of the elven fabric. "In the last days before the Battle of Five Armies, when they both knew that death was coming and chose love anyway." But as his hands touched the cloak, the whispers in the gold grew louder, and suddenly the chamber was filled with visions that existed somewhere between memory and dream. They saw Kili as he had been in life, young and brave and foolish, with the recklessness of one who thought his heart stronger than the hatred of ages. They saw Tauriel bending over his wounds in the ruins of Lake Town, her healing magic flowing from her hands like starlight made tangible. And they saw something else, a figure standing in the shadows of the chamber, visible only from the corner of the eye but unmistakably present. She was tall as all elves are tall, with hair like flame and eyes like summer twilight, and around her flowed the same starlight that had once healed mortal wounds. "My lady," Balin breathed, dropping to one knee with the instinctive reverence of one who recognizes true nobility. "Tauriel of the Woodland Realm, you honor us with your presence." The figure turned toward them, and though her lips did not move, her voice filled the chamber with music that made the very stones weep for beauty. "I come because love calls to love," she said, "and because the bonds that tie my spirit to this world grow thin. Soon I must choose, to maintain the watch I have kept for 3,000 years, or to break it and seek the peace that lies beyond all choosing." Young Thorin rose from where he had knelt beside his companion, Kili's cloak still clasped in his hands. "What would you have us do, my lady? How can we help you find the freedom to choose as your heart desires?" Her smile was sad as winter sunlight, beautiful but touched with the knowledge of endings. "Bring me my son," she said simply. "Let him see that love need not be a chain that binds, but a gift that liberates. Let him understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go." The vision faded like morning mist, leaving the two dwarves alone in the treasure chamber, with only the memory of starlight and the sound of gold singing songs of sacrifice. But the cloak in Thorin's hand seemed lighter now, as if it had been blessed by the touch of spirit, and the arrows in Kili's quiver gleamed with their own inner light. "Come," Balin said, his ancient voice steady despite the wonder they had witnessed. "The others wait above, and the road to Dol Guldur grows short. If we would serve the cause of love's freedom, we must not linger in dreams of what was but prepare for what yet may be." As they climbed from the depths of the mountain, neither dwarf spoke of what they had seen, for some experiences are too sacred for common words. But in their hearts they carried the certainty that their quest was blessed by powers greater than any earthly kingdom, and that the choice they rode to witness would echo through all the halls of time. Behind them, in the treasure chamber where dragonfire had once burned, the gold continued its whispered song of love and loss, a melody that would play until the very foundations of the mountain crumbled to dust. For some, music is eternal, and the harmony of hearts united across the gulf of death is the sweetest music of all. Section 14. A blade not yet drawn in the fortress of Dol Guldur, where shadow reigned eternal, and malice had put down roots deeper than the foundations of the hill. The necromancer waited with the patience of one who had learned to measure time in ages rather than years. His form had grown, more solid as the hour of confrontation approached, drawing substance from the darkness that served him and power from the corruption he had wrought upon the bonds of love. Around him, the nine walked in circles that described patterns of binding and compulsion, their black breath hissing through the empty sockets where once they had worn crowns. They were his captains now, the Nazgul who had once been kings of men but had chosen dominion over freedom and found themselves slaves to a will greater and more terrible than their own. "The Elf Queen's spirit grows restless," spoke the Witch King, his voice like the sound of tombs opening in midnight graveyards. "The bindings that hold her weaken as the living approach. Soon she will break free of our influence entirely, unless we provide her with a choice that seems like freedom, but is in truth the deepest slavery of all," the necromancer finished, his voice rich with malicious satisfaction. "Yes, my faithful servant, the trap is baited and the net is spread. Soon they will come to offer her liberation, never knowing that the very act of choosing will bind her more tightly than any chain we could forge." In the highest tower of the fortress, where the Palantir sat shrouded in veils of shadow, visions played that showed the approach of those who thought themselves her rescuers. The necromancer watched them ride through the grey lands south of Mirkwood, noting the way they held themselves, the weapons they bore, the light that seemed to surround them like armor against the dark. "Fools," he whispered, though there was admiration in his voice as well as contempt. "They come in hope and honor, believing that love is stronger than hate, that sacrifice can overcome corruption. They do not understand that love itself can be made the instrument of its own destruction." The greatest of the nine stepped forward, his crown of iron catching what little light existed in that accursed place. "Master, what if they succeed? What if the Elf Queen chooses freedom over bondage, peace over protection? What if we lose the weapon we have forged from her very love?" The necromancer's laughter was soft as silk and sharp as steel. "Then, my dear Camul, we will have gained something far more valuable than any single weapon. We will have proven that even the purest love can be turned to serve the darkness, that even the noblest sacrifice can be corrupted to evil purpose. The despair that follows such a revelation will be worth more than all the armies we might command." In the depths of the fortress, where Toriel's spirit was held in bonds of shadow and compulsion, the light that marked her essence flickered like a candle in a hurricane. For 3,000 years she had maintained her watch, pouring her very being into the protection of the lands she loved. But now that protection had become a torment, her love transformed into a chain that bound her to purposes she would never have chosen. She felt them coming, felt Legolas's presence like a beacon in the darkness, felt Thranduil's anguish like a wound in her own heart. Most of all, she felt the weight of the choice that lay ahead, the terrible freedom that would soon be offered to her. For she alone, among all the players in this cosmic game, understood the true nature of the trap that had been set. To choose freedom and break the binding would indeed grant her peace, but it would also leave the northern lands defenseless against the shadow that crept ever closer. To choose bondage and maintain her watch would preserve the protection she had died to provide, but it would also give the enemy the weapon he sought to turn her love into hatred, her sacrifice into a tool of conquest. There was, perhaps, a third choice, one that none of the planners had foreseen, one that would require a sacrifice greater than any she had yet made. But to choose that path would demand not just her own willing surrender, but the understanding and cooperation of all who loved her, and whether they could find the wisdom to see beyond their own desires to the greater good that lay beyond all choosing. That remained to be seen. In the grey lands where the company of her would-be rescuers rode through the gathering dusk, storm clouds massed on the horizon, like armies gathering for war. Lightning flickered between their depths, and in its blue-white flash could be seen shapes that belonged to no natural storm. winged forms that circled the fortress of Dol Guldur, like carrion birds waiting for the feast to begin. The final act of this ancient drama was about to unfold, and the choices made in the hours ahead would determine not just the fate of one spirit bound by love, but the very nature of hope and despair in the hearts of all who dwelt beneath the starlit sky. Section 15. The Kingdom Reclaimed. The gates of Dol Guldur stood open as the company approached through the gathering darkness, their black iron leaves spread wide like the jaws of some great beast yawning to swallow the light. No guard stood upon the battlements. No challenge rang out from the towers. Only silence greeted them, heavy and expectant as the air before a thunderstorm. King Thranduil drew rein at the threshold, his ancient eyes scanning the courtyard beyond, where shadows moved without source or purpose. "It is too easy," he said, his voice carrying the weight of millennia spent in war against the dark. "The enemy offers no resistance because he desires our presence within his stronghold." "Of course he does," Gandalf replied, his staff blazing with sudden light that drove back the pressing darkness. "We come offering Tauriel the choice he wants her to make. The choice between love and duty, between freedom and bondage. He believes that in the very act of choosing, she will damn herself more thoroughly than any chain he could forge." Prince Legolas guided his horse through the open gates, his bow ready in his hands and his eyes bright with a light that owed nothing to the wizard's staff. "Then we must ensure she understands the full nature of what is offered," he said simply. "We must help her see that there is wisdom in love, and love in wisdom, and that sometimes the greatest choice is to transcend choosing altogether." They rode into the courtyard where no living thing grew, and the very stones seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Before them rose the central tower of the fortress, its walls black as midnight, and its windows glowing with the sickly light of corrupted magic. At its base stood a door that belonged to no mortal architecture, tall as a tree and carved with symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon. As they dismounted and prepared to enter that accursed place, the door swung open of its own accord, revealing a stairway that spiraled upward into darkness. From its depths came the sound of singing, not the harsh chants of orcs or the cruel laughter of demons, but a voice fair and clear as starlight, singing lamentations in the ancient tongue of the Eldar. "She calls to us," Legolas whispered, his fair face marked by pain that transcended any physical wound. "She sings the songs she taught me when I was young, the melodies that brought light to the darkest corners of our halls." "It may be her voice," Thranduil said grimly, "but the song is shaped by the will of our enemy. Be on your guard, my son. The greatest trap is often baited with the sweetest lure." Together they climbed the spiral stair, their footsteps echoing in the hollow spaces of the tower like the beating of funeral drums. With each step they took, the singing grew clearer, and soon they could make out words that spoke of love, lost and hope deferred, of choices made in darkness and their bitter consequences in the light. At last, they reached a chamber at the tower's heart, and there they found her. Tauriel stood in the center of a circle carved into the floor, her form translucent as morning mist, but substantial enough that they could see the sorrow in her eyes. Around her wove chains of shadow and starlight, beautiful to behold, but terrible in their purpose, for they were forged not of metal, but of love itself, turned to purposes she had never intended. "My son," she said, and her voice carried all the warmth that had filled their halls in the days before shadow fell upon them. "My beloved king, my faithful friends, you come at last to offer me what I have desired for 3,000 years, the choice to lay down my burden and seek the peace that lies beyond all sorrow." Legolas stepped forward, his hand extended as if to touch the chains that bound her, but Gandalf caught his arm with a grip strong as iron. "Beware," the wizard whispered. "This is the moment of greatest peril. One wrong word, one gesture made in haste, and the trap will spring shut upon us all." "What trap?" Toriel asked, and in her voice was genuine puzzlement. "I see here only those I love, come to grant me the freedom I have so long desired. Surely there is no harm in choosing what my heart most yearns for." It was Thorin Oakenshield who answered, the Dwarf King stepping from the shadows with Killy's cloak clasped in his hands. "My lady," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding dearly bought, "the trap lies not in choosing freedom, but in believing that freedom and duty must always stand opposed. My nephew learned this truth too late, that love's greatest expression is not in taking what we desire, but in giving what is needed." The chains around Toriel flickered, their starlight dimming as if responding to words that carried more than mortal weight. "Speak plainly," she said, though her form seemed less solid than before. "What choice do you offer that I have not already considered?" Thranduil stepped forward, his golden crown catching the strange light of that place and transforming it into something beautiful and clean. "We offer you the choice to transcend choosing," he said, his voice strong despite the pain it carried, "not to break the binding or maintain it, but to transform it into something new. A protection freely given rather than a duty grimly borne." Around them, the very walls of the chamber began to shake as forces beyond mortal understanding clashed in the spaces between breath and heartbeat. For the necromancer's trap was springing, but not in the way he had intended. The offer of transcendence rather than mere choice was rewriting the very nature of the binding, turning compulsion into gift and slavery into freedom. In the depths of the fortress, the Dark Lord's rage erupted like a volcano given voice, but it was too late. The trap he had woven with such care was unraveling, and the weapon he had forged from love's corruption was becoming something else entirely, a beacon that would shine with such light that all the shadows in Middle-earth would find no place to hide. The final choice was at hand, and the nature of love itself hung in the balance. Section 16. A ring still sleeps. In the deep places of the earth, where roots run deeper than memory and darkness is older than the sun, something stirred that had lain hidden since the elder days. Far beneath the halls of Dol Guldur, in chambers that existed between the world of form and the realm of spirit, the true architect of corruption sat upon a throne carved from the heartwood of trees that had died in the first kinstrife of the Eldar. This was not the necromancer who walked in the fortress above, not the shadow form that the wise had driven from Greenwood 3 times in the long years of the Third Age. This was Sauron himself in his truest essence, the Maya who had once served in the halls of Aule and learned the secrets of making and shaping before pride, and the desire for dominion had corrupted his noble purpose. Around him in the darkness lay the instruments of his power, not rings or swords or crowns of earthly make, but the fundamental forces that shape the music of creation itself. Here was the power to twist love into hate, to transform hope into despair, to make the very bonds that held the world together serve his will instead of the Valar's design. But greatest and most terrible of all his weapons was the thing that hung above his throne in a sphere of crystallized shadow. A ring of gold that seemed simple enough to mortal eyes, yet contained within its circle more malice than all the armies of Mordor could unleash. The one ring, the master ring, the ruling ring that would command all others when the time came for its revelation. "Not yet," Sauron whispered to himself, his voice like the sound of mountains grinding against each other in the deep places of the earth. "Not yet does the hour come for you to wake, my precious. First, let me test the new weapon that chance and their own folly have placed in my hands." Above him, in the chamber where Toriel's spirit stood bound by chains of corrupted love, the moment of choice was approaching its climax. Through the eyes of his servants, through the shadows that were extensions of his will, the Dark Lord watched as his enemies gathered around the Elf Queen and prepared to offer her the liberation that would become her damnation. But something was wrong. The words they spoke, the choices they offered, these were not what his calculations had predicted. Instead of the simple choice between freedom and duty that would have given him power over her spirit, they offered something far more dangerous, the possibility of transformation itself. Transcendence, he hissed, and the word burned his tongue like acid. They offer her transcendence, the one thing that can break any binding I might forge. If she chooses not freedom or bondage, but the path between them. If she transforms her duty into gift. The ring above his throne pulsed with sudden malevolent light, responding to its master's rage. For in all his long years of corruption and conquest, Sauron had never found a weapon against willing sacrifice. Slaves he could command, the fearful he could control, even the proud he could bend to his will through promises of power. But those who gave freely, who chose love over self, who made of their very beings a gift for others, these were beyond his reach. "No!" he snarled, rising from his throne with terrible purpose. "I will not allow it. If I cannot corrupt her through choice, then I will compel her through force. If I cannot make her love into a weapon against her people, then I will break that love entirely and leave only hatred in its place." The shadows around him began to move with purpose, that spoke of powers beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. Up through the stones of Dol Guldur they flowed, carrying with them the concentrated malice of 3,000 years spent in perfecting the arts of domination. They would pour into the chamber where Tauriel's spirit waited, would seize upon her essence and drag it down into the darkness where love could be torn from her heart and replaced with the bitter ashes of despair. But even as the shadows rose toward their target, other forces moved to meet them. From the halls of the Woodland Realm came light that owed nothing to star or sun, the accumulated love of all who had known Tauriel in life, focused and directed by King Thranduil's will. From the throne of Erebor came the fire of the mountain itself, purified by the sacrifice of a king who chose love over pride. From the depths of Moria came voices raised in songs that had not been heard since the dwarves delved in the days of the world's youth. And from a hole in the ground in the Shire, where an old hobbit sat writing in a book bound in red leather, came perhaps the greatest power of all, the simple belief that love is indeed stronger than hate, that mercy triumphs over vengeance, that even the smallest act of kindness can change the course of history. The forces met in the space between heartbeats, in the realm where thought becomes reality and will shapes the very fabric of existence. Light clashed with shadow, love wrestled with hate, and in the center of it all stood a single spirit whose choice would determine which power would prove the stronger. In his hidden chamber beneath the fortress, Sauron felt the outcome trembling in the balance, and knew that the victory he had sought for 3 millennia might yet slip through his fingers. But he had one weapon left, one final card to play that might yet turn the tide in his favor. Above his throne, the ring pulsed with hungry light, and for the first time in an age of the world, its master began to consider whether the hour of its revelation might come sooner than he had planned. The fate of all Middle-earth hung upon the choice of a single spirit, and in the darkness beneath Dol Guldur, the eye of Sauron opened fully for the first time since the last alliance brought him low. Section 17. The enemy withdraws. The chamber at the heart of Dol Guldur erupted with light that had no earthly source, a radiance that spoke not of flame or crystal, but of something far more precious. The willing sacrifice of one who chooses love over self. Duty transformed into gift. The very bonds of affection made into weapons against the dark. Tauriel stood in the center of that blazing illumination. Her form no longer translucent, but solid as starlight made manifest. The chains that had bound her transformed into streams of silver fire that flowed outward to touch the hearts of all who stood witness. "I choose," she said, and her voice carried the authority of one who has looked beyond the circles of the world and seen what lies there. "I choose not freedom nor bondage, not rest nor duty, but transformation. Let my love become a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits, a passage that can be crossed in both directions when great need calls." The words fell like music into the chamber, and as they did, the very stones of Dol Guldur began to crack and crumble. For the fortress had been built upon the foundation of corrupted love, and when that corruption was purified, the entire structure lost its anchor in the world of form. Through the breaking walls came wind that smelled of starflowers and green growing things, driving out the stench of shadow that had lingered there for 3,000 years. But in the depths of the fortress, in chambers that existed between reality and nightmare, the true Dark Lord raged with fury that shook the foundations of the hill. The weapon he had forged from Tauriel's sacrifice had become a blade turned against him, and worse, her choice of transcendence had opened a path that others might follow, a way to transform even the deepest corruption into something clean and bright. "This shall not stand," Sauron snarled, his form growing more solid as his rage fed upon itself. Around him, the shadows that were extensions of his will writhed like living things in torment. "If I cannot have her as my weapon, then I will have the satisfaction of seeing her destroyed, and with her, all who dared to offer hope where I would have sown despair." The ring above his throne pulsed with malevolent eagerness, sensing its master's readiness to reveal powers that had long been held in reserve. But as Sauron reached toward it, preparing to claim its might for the battle ahead, other forces moved to thwart him. From the chamber above came Gandalf's voice, raised in words of binding that had been old when the world was young, spells taught by the Valar themselves for the containment of corrupt Maiar. From the breaking walls of the fortress poured the combined will of all the free peoples, elves and dwarves and men, and even hobbits, all united in their determination that love should triumph over hate. But strongest of all was the power that flowed from Tauriel herself, no longer bound by the limitations of single purpose, but free to act as her heart directed. She who had spent 3 millennia as a guardian against the dark now became something more, a herald of light that could drive back shadows from the deepest places of the earth. The battle was brief, but terrible. Forces clashing that belonged to the very foundations of existence. In the end, it was not strength that decided the outcome, but the simple fact that willing sacrifice cannot be overcome by any power that seeks to compel. Sauron's rage beat against Tauriel's love like waves against a cliff of adamant, and finding no purchase there, was forced to withdraw. With a scream that shattered stone and sent cracks running through the very bedrock of the hill, the Dark Lord abandoned his stronghold. His essence flowed away like poison draining from a wound, seeking refuge in the distant fortress of Barad-dûr, where he could nurse his defeat and plan new strategies of domination. Behind him, he left only Imdami, emptiness, and the slowly crumbling walls of Dol Guldur. No longer a fortress of shadow, but merely another ruin in the wild lands of Middle-earth. In the chamber where the confrontation had reached its climax, the company of heroes stood in wonder at what they had witnessed. Tauriel's spirit glowed with gentle radiance, her form stable now and her face peaceful in a way it had not been for 3,000 years. The chains that had bound her were gone, transformed into something that looked almost like wings. Not for flight, but as symbols of the freedom she had found not through escape, but through the willing acceptance of transformation. "It is finished," she said, her voice soft as summer rain. "The binding that held me is broken, but the protection it provided remains. I am free to come and go as I choose, to walk in the world of the living when need calls, and to rest in the halls beyond when peace is desired. The darkness that crept from this place will find no purchase in our lands, for love freely given is stronger than any weapon that hate can forge. Legolas stepped forward, his eyes bright with tears that were neither of sorrow nor of joy, but of something far deeper, the recognition of love that transcends even the bonds of family, that seeks not to possess, but to liberate. "Mother," he said simply, and in that one word was contained all the love and loss and hope of 3 millennia. "My son," she replied, reaching out to touch his face with fingers that seemed solid, but carried still the coolness of starlight. "You have grown wise in the years of my absence, wiser than I was when I made my first choice in haste and shadow. You understand now what I could not then, that love's greatest expression is not in the holding, but in the letting go." Around them, the ruins of Dol Guldur continued their collapse, but there was no violence in it now, only the gentle settling of stones that had served their purpose and could now return to the earth from which they came. Where the fortress had stood would grow again the green things that belonged to the natural world, and in time, no trace would remain of the shadow that had once made its stronghold there. The victory was complete, but it was not the victory that any of them had expected when they first rode from the halls of the Elven King. They had come seeking to offer freedom to one who was bound, and instead had discovered that true freedom lay not in escape from responsibility, but in the transformation of duty into gift, of burden into blessing. As they prepared to leave the ruins behind and return to their respective realms, each member of the company carried with them something more precious than any treasure: the knowledge that love, when freely given and wisely guided, is indeed the strongest force in all the circles of the world. Section 18. Hope in Ashes. The seasons turned, and spring came early to the lands that had so long lain under shadow. In the Bunny Yedinlali Woodland Realm, where once the paths had wound dark and dangerous between trees that whispered of old sorrows, now the ways ran bright and clean. Starflowers bloomed in groves where none had grown for 3,000 years, and the very air sang with melodies that spoke of joy renewed and burdens lifted. King Thranduil walked those paths in the soft light of early morning, his step lighter than it had been since the elder days when the world was young and grief had not yet learned to make its home in the hearts of the firstborn. Beside him walked his son, no longer burdened by the weight of unspoken sorrow, but free to speak of the mother whose love had protected them all. "She comes often now," Legolas said, his voice warm with contentment that had long been absent from the halls of his people. "Not as she was in life, bound by the constraints of flesh and time, but as she has become, a bridge between the world that is and the world that lies beyond all endings. The children love her stories, and she teaches them songs that were old when Mythland was young." "And yet she is at peace?" Thranduil asked, though in his heart he knew the answer. "She has found the rest that was so long denied her." "She has found something better than rest," Legolas replied. "She has found purpose freely chosen rather than duty grimly borne. When the great darkness comes, for come it will, as surely as winter follows autumn, she will stand with us by choice rather than compulsion. And that choice will make all the difference." They walked in comfortable silence through groves, where the morning light fell like blessings through leaves that rustled with more than wind. In the deeper woods, where few eyes could see, other figures sometimes moved. Spirits of the noble dead who had chosen to linger in Middle-earth, not from inability to let go, but from love too strong to be contained by the boundaries between life and death. In the halls of Erebor, the songs that rang from the forges spoke no longer of gold and jewels, but of higher treasures, of friendship forged in the fires of adversity, of love that bridges the ancient gulf between kindreds, of sacrifices made not from duty, but from the free choice of noble hearts. Young Prince Thorin had taken his father's crown and proven worthy of it, ruling with wisdom that had been earned in the shadow places of the world. The cloak that had once belonged to Kili and Tauriel now hung in the Hall of Memory, where the deeds of heroes were recorded for all future generations to remember. Children came to look upon it and hear the tale of the dwarf who loved an elf and the elf who chose transformation over transcendence, and in their hearts the ancient hatred between the kindreds found no place to take root. In Rivendell, where the wise gathered to read the signs of the times and prepare for the storms that were yet to come, Elrond and Gandalf sat beneath the stars and spoke of the victory that had been won in the ruins of Azasindoth, Dol Guldur. But their conversation turned not to the enemy's defeat, but to the deeper truth that had been revealed, that love, when freely given and wisely guided, possessed the power to transform even the most corrupted forces into weapons of light. "The Dark Lord still dwells in Barad-dûr," Gandalf observed, his grey eyes distant with the weight of knowledge that pressed upon his spirit. "He still commands the Nine and holds dominion over the Black Lands of the East. The victory we won has wounded him deeply, but it has not ended the threat he poses to all the free peoples." "No," Elrond agreed, his voice carrying the authority of one who had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms beyond counting. "But it has shown us something more valuable than any military victory could provide. It has proven that the power of darkness, no matter how great, cannot ultimately triumph over love that seeks not to possess, but to liberate." Far to the south, in the Shire where the grass grew green and the gardens bloomed in neat rows, Bilbo Baggins sat in his study writing in the Red Book that would someday carry the tale of his adventures to every corner of Middle-earth. But now he wrote not of dragons or treasure or the long road home, but of a different kind of adventure. The journey from selfishness to sacrifice, from fear to love, from the desire to possess to the willingness to let go. In the end, he wrote, his pen scratching across the parchment in the careful script of the Shire, "It is not the great who shape history, but the small choices made by ordinary folk when they are faced with the chance to choose love over fear. A dwarf who dies for an elf who transforms duty into gift, a hobbit who shows mercy to a creature that deserves none. These are the moments that change the world, not through force, but through the simple recognition that we are all connected by bonds stronger than steel and more precious than mithril." As night fell over Middle-earth, the stars shone down upon a world where hope had been renewed and the foundations of darkness had been shaken. The long defeat continued, as it always had and always would. But now there was light to guide the steps of those who walked in shadow, and love to warm the hearts of those who faced the cold winds of adversity. In the deep places of the earth, where an ancient evil plotted its return to power, the Dark Lord felt that light and hated it with a fury that burned brighter than the fires of Mount Doom. But even his hatred could not extinguish what had been kindled in the Chamber of Choice, and deep in his heart of hearts, he began to fear that perhaps, just perhaps, love might indeed prove stronger than hate in the end. The tale was told, but the story it spoke of would continue for as long as hearts beat, and choices must be made between darkness and light. And in every moment when love triumphed over fear, when sacrifice overcame selfishness, when hope proved stronger than despair, the spirit of Tauriel would be there, not as a chain that binds, but as a bridge that connects all the children of Ilúvatar in the great song that shapes the world. In such small victories, the greatest battles are won. In such quiet choosing, the fate of ages is decided. And in such love, freely given and transformed by wisdom, lies the only hope that can truly stand against the darkness that ever seeks to claim dominion over the hearts of the free peoples. Thus ends the tale of the secret reason why Legolas never speaks about his mother in 3,000 years. A secret that was not shame, but sacred love. Not loss, but transformation. Not ending, but beginning anew.